And we're live.
Well, good afternoon, everyone in the Flagstaff and broader community. We are excited to be here with you all again today as we discuss the weeping time and a discussion of restorative justice and what it means in the legacy of slavery in America. I am privileged to be joined by Reverend Dr. Bernadine Lewis and Pastor Charlie McCallie as we launch into this conversation. We want to remind everyone who's joining us today that these conversations are live streamed on the Murdoch Community Center page, and you are welcome as we are going through our presentations to ask any questions that you may have for our open Q&A session towards the end of this presentation. And with that, we're going to launch right in, and I'm going to invite Reverend Bernadine Lewis to speak on the Weeping Day, the story of Jeffery and Dorcas, and the forgotten history of the largest slave auction ever on American soil. Dr. Lewis was raised in the Geechee Gullah culture of Sapelo Island, Georgia, and is a graduate of Bennett College and a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority, Incorporated. Ms. Lewis holds an MBA from Marist College and is currently serving as Director of Undergraduate Programs in the Franke College of Business at Northern Arizona University. She was a very successful jewelry retailer with collections from artisans all over the world and has a deep interest in anything Black culture related. Welcome, Dr. Lewis.
Thank you. We're just going to go ahead and get right in. I was just sharing before we went live that this is a lecture that, and she's not able to watch today, but Dr. Stephanie Kunze is a professor at NAU and teaches two courses in one on slavery and the other on Black Native Americans. And this is the hot topic for today because someone heard this story. They joined in on the lecture and felt like it needed to be a hot topic for today. And so if people are wondering where do we come up with the ideas for these broadcasts, we've said it a few times. It really comes up in conversations or daily experiences that we as people of color or of African descent are having in our daily lives. So before we begin, would like to begin by giving honor to the spirit of the ancestors who landed on the eastern coastal shores to be distributed as humans for sale into the slave trade. And so what we're seeing on the screen right now is actually a slavery monument that is on Savannah's River Street. And we're going to focus today on Savannah. The weeping time happened in Savannah. And so just to give homage, to give honor to all of the lost souls, unknown souls, who were brought from the shores of Africa to Georgia, to the Carolinas, to Virginia, to work as enslaved Africans. This is, as mentioned before, the weeping time, which actually happened. It was a 2-day slave sale, and it is known as the largest slave auction in American history. It happened in 2 days, March 2nd and 3rd of 1859. And I want to share a few stories that happened during this 2-day sale and to sort of give you a history of Savannah and its slave narrative as we go along. But before we get started, this is where it all began for me. And if you notice, and if anyone has ever been to Savannah, and we usually have viewers from Savannah to join us, this is historic downtown Savannah. And this is the Juliet Low House. And if anyone has been a Girl Scout, they know the name Juliet Low. And if they know their Girl Scout history, the Girl Scouts was founded in Savannah by Juliet uh, Gordon Low. So this is a picture of her birthplace downtown. And this is where my knowledge began, ironically, of the weeping tree. I was actually Savannah's first Black tour guide for the Girl Scouts. And so I went through extensive training about the history of Savannah. But my father encouraged me to look beyond what I was being taught in those trainings. And it was about a 6-week training, because I questioned there was nothing about Black history in this, but yet I was aware, very much aware of the Black history of Savannah. So I went to the library and to ask about any Black history in Savannah, particularly historic Savannah. And I'll never forget, here it is, I was in 9th grade, and the librarian, who was African American, uh, lit up and said, I have one that you've never heard about. And she shared the weeping tree, or the weeping time, with me. And so this is how I became aware of the weeping time. Many people in Savannah are unaware of the weeping time. And so that's what we want to share with you today. Savannah is a beautiful city. If you've ever been, if you're just seeing it now in these photographs, a beautiful historic town. Very beautiful. The cobblestone streets, the Victorian homes. This is Forsyth Park with the beautiful fountain in the center of the park. And if you know anything about Sherman and his march on this side on the world, on the East Coast, when he got to Savannah, he decided to spare Savannah because the story goes, and I talked about it in my tours as a Girl Scout, that he thought it was very beautiful, and so he spared it. The other theory was that he had a girlfriend there, and she was as beautiful as Savannah, and he did not want her to lose her home, and so he spared Savannah. And then there's a third theory that he was a Mason, and right before he was about to burn Savannah, the Mason came out and met with him. And because they are in the same brotherhood, Sherman showed some leniency as requested by his fellow Mason brother. I also have to pay homage to Dr. King, who spent a lot of time in Savannah. He felt like Savannah, and it's another ironic thought that the story that I'm going to share today, but he felt like Savannah was the most desegregated city in Georgia. And so he would often come to Savannah to get away, and he loved going to the beach. And so if anyone here again is familiar with some of our old Negro spirituals, Wade in the Water is one. And hopefully in one of these broadcasts, we will be able to go into the meanings behind the lyrics of some of these old spirituals. But the black and white photo down on the water, down on the bottom of the screen, is a photo from the Wade-ins, which were protests. Blacks were asking to be allowed to be on the beach. But there's something interesting about Savannah. There's a north side of the beach that's very isolated that was actually owned mostly by Black people. And so this is where Dr. King was able to come and spend most of his time when visiting the beach. But let's start our story here on Savannah River Street. This is the gateway to the city. Very beautiful cobblestones uh, laid all by slaves from Africa. Now these are all of your shops, all of your tourist attractions. You can take the riverboat up and down the river to really see the beauty of Savannah and how it is situated. But I want us to keep this scene and this one in mind, because where we see this riverboat, this is actually where slave ships docked, and Africans got off of the ship and walked across the street where you see these shops now that are, of course, now very modern, but these buildings are still the historic buildings and hold the memory of Savannah's slave narrative. So let's call this Coming to America, and this indeed today will be a story that you did not learn in your history books. I must say that this is our warning that I'm going to show some what may be considered to be graphic or disturbing to others, but keep in mind, we always say in these discussions, these aren't easy topics. This lecture, when I share it with students, is always very emotional for me as well. And so I would expect it to be so for some of our viewers. This is how uh, enslaved humans came to America from Africa. If you ever get the chance to visit the Black History Museum, which is a part of the Smithsonian in DC, you should absolutely, it's worth the wait for tickets, worth the time standing in the line to go and see this. So this is an actual life-size replica of a slave ship, showing just the bottom hull, the hull of the ship, the first level. This is how humans were placed onto the ship, and actually the first slave ships were they stacked humans on top of one another, and let's note that this voyage, this what we call the Middle Passage, could take anywhere from 1 to 6 months, depending on the time of the year with the hurricanes and the weather, the seasonal weather. But the beginnings of these voyages, humans were actually stacked on top of one another. So when I say this was just the first level, imagine 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 humans on top of one another for 1 to 6 months. And then let's also keep in mind that there were women who were with child, who uh, had their babies during this voyage. So imagine these humans lying in human excrement. You couldn't get up and say, I have to use the restroom. Um, I'm having my baby, I need to go into the labor room or the labor area of the ship. None of this. Bodily functions, having your baby, menstrual times or moon times, as I prefer to call them, all of this was a part of this voyage, and coming from these were shared body fluids, quite frankly, in a 1 to 6 month voyage. But then the captains, and those who were in this business decided, you know what, we've got to come up with a better plan. We need them to survive. They're getting sick and dying before we can get to America. So this became the humane thing to do, was to build these compartments on the ship rather than stack humans on top of humans. Here again, still, you were not allowed to get up and go to the restroom or go to the labor room to have your children, but this was basically to ensure that there was more or a higher number of survival during these 1 to 6 month cruises, voyages. Um, these are slave accessories. These were used during the voyages and after, to keep them quiet, to keep them from escaping, to subdue these humans, to punish these humans. And so now we're back to Savannah. We've arrived and we saw River Street. And so when I showed the earlier picture of River Street, we saw the long walkway. And so these humans were actually walked along these same cobblestones into, this is the east side of River Street, which was known to have a few businesses. And these businesses were selling humans for the slave trade. This particular building was known to be a showroom for slaves. The Montmolin building, it was called, and it housed the operations for slave traders like John Montmolin and Alexander Bryan from about the mid 1850s until the surrender of Savannah in December, which happened in 1864. So hundreds, perhaps thousands of slaves were brought up the stairs during those years and then sold. And history tells us that each one of these windows, and I've been inside the building many times, so these windows represent separate rooms. And so the rooms featured, if you were looking for a human that was a carpenter or was very good with cattle and horses, very good with cotton, growing cotton and rice. So each one of these rooms you would be taken into to inspect the human merchandise, and the bottom floor was where the sales were finalized. When you look to the right of your screen, these are what are called barracoons. And barracoons are simply slave encampments. This is where, once those humans were walked down River Street, they were stopped here in the barracoons. They were splashed with water to give them a quick bath, and then they were marched into the building to be showcased for sale. Some people refer to these spaces as slave dungeons throughout the East Coast. You will find these in South Carolina, in Virginia. And so this is where they were kept clean and kept and stored until they were taken to the office to be placed on sale. Now, cars, business people who own these buildings, now you can park your cars there. So now it's parking spaces. As we get ready to talk about the weeping time, I want to share three of the highest sales before the weeping time, which we'll talk about. It was advertised to sell 440 humans, but in actuality, it only had a sale of 436 humans. But prior to that, we see one sale for 178 humans or slaves, one just arriving from Africa with 240 humans, and then 250, and this was in 1860. So this actually was a sale after the weeping time with their sale of 436 humans. So here we are with the newspaper ad for this upcoming March sale. 440 Negroes, persons desiring to inspect these Negroes will find them at the racetrack, where they can be seen from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. until day of sale. J. Bryan Johnson Square. So this was actually the advertisement. I should add that although it's not mentioned in this ad, but there was a stipulation, and this is very important to the story that we'll share today. There was a stipulation that there was not to be any separation or division of families during this sale. So this is where our story really begins. Pierce Meese Butler in the center actually inherited the land from his grandfather, who is on the left of your screen. And this would be, if Pierce Butler sounds familiar to you, it should, because Pierce Meese Butler is the grandson of Pierce Butler, who is one and the same, one of our founding fathers of this United States. He was a former U.S. Senator who was also a South Carolina slave owner, a rice planter, while being a politician. He was also an officer in the Revolutionary War. So this is who Pierce Meese Butler would inherit the plantations from his grandfather. Pierce Meese Butler at the time was living in Philadelphia, spent very little time in Savannah, Georgia, in Georgia at all, until he lost all of his wealth on gambling. Actually, he's known in Philadelphia as Playboy Pierce Butler. He lost his money, and it's said that it was a little over $700,000 to gambling, to supporting risky businesses, and lavish spending on luxuries. The lady that we see here is Frances Fanny, nickname Kimball, who was a Shakespearean actress from London, who actually would come to the United States to perform. So she was very well known. She was actually a celebrity. Well, she and Pierce Meese Butler would meet and get married. They would have two children, and she would actually get to see plantation life, write about it, and really became an abolitionist, despite the marriage to a husband who inherited 400 and, well, actually inherited 900 slaves. But they somehow found a way to be in love, to be married. They would divorce a little after the weeping time, because that was the breaking point. She writes about this experience. So we have her account, and we have the account of another writer from the New York Times that we're going to talk about. So these slave sales would have a catalog. And in these catalogs, much like what catalogs are for, we would see what's for sale. And so at the bottom, this is just an example of a catalog from a plantation in New Orleans, but it gives you the names of the individuals, their age, and what they're capable of doing. We see George, Sue, and Little George and Harry. These are four individuals who were actually in the catalog for the Savannah sale. For instance, George, an adult, 27, prime cotton planter, which meant that he and Sue, also prime, were able to lead the process on growing cotton. So they knew everything. Their expertise was in cotton. And then we think that George and Harry are their two children. I wanted to share this photo. This is actually an auction block and the slave owners stand. These are still in some cities and towns on the East Coast. This one actually is from Virginia, from a plantation in Virginia. So the auctioneer would stand on his block, but the human would be required to step up so that they could be seen from the crowd, to be selected by whomever for sale. But when you were in the business of slave trading, you had a nice office and you had everything indoors, and you were able to build a nice stage for humans to step up on, to be seen. And so when we begin talking about the weeping time, this is much this is actually a painting done on woodcut of what that day, what that scene looked like. So here is the first family that I'd like to share their story. And let me just read this to you. Keep in mind, I mentioned earlier that we have the account of Mrs. Butler, or Fanny Kimball Butler, and then we have the account of Mortimer Thompson, who was the New York, I said the New York Times, but the New York Tribune writer. And he was able to go to this sale by impersonating or representing himself as a potential buyer. He could not, and he knew he would not be admitted into the sale if he had said, I'm a writer and I want to come in and write about this event. So he came in as someone who was interested in buying humans, which was what this sale day was all about. If you notice, there's a family that's up on the auction block, And the story tells us that there's a slave named Primus, and he and his wife Daphne, they step up with their 3-year-old daughter and a newborn. And so Daphne, if you can see, is wrapped, she has a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and, she's clutching the baby to her breast. Well, the story goes that the bidders were irked by this, that she had herself wrapped up, and they could not see what they were possibly interested in buying. So this is what this Mortimer says happened. "What do you keep your nigger covered up for?" one bidder yelled. "Pull off her blanket." "What's the matter with the gal?" another man said. "Ain't she sound? Pull off her rags and let's see her." The auctioneer explained that the mother was merely trying to keep her baby, who was born just 15 days earlier, warm. Daphne removed the blanket, exposing her child and herself, and the family sold for $2,500. And so, what Mortimer um, does is he records this day, all of his observations. He focuses on the emotional impact on the men, the women, and the children. And mind you, there were 30 babies that were also sold that day. There's another story. This is an actual painting. It's in Miss Winfrey's personal collection. It is called "To the Highest Bidder." It was done by Harry Roseland back in 1904 or 1906. But to share another story, like the slave dealers, Thompson used his copy of the catalog to make notes, transcribing conversations that he overheard. So this is one of those stories. "Well, Colonel, I see you looking sharp at Shoemaker Bill's Sally," one buyer said to another. "Going to buy her?" "I think not," the other man replied. "Sally's a good, big, strapping gal and can do a heap of work. But it's 5 years since she had any children. She's done breeding, I reckon." So this is just one story of one of those women that was sold during the weeping time, Sally. The most sad story, it is the saddest story of this day, is the story of Jeffrey and Dorcas. Jeffrey has just been bought by his new master, and he's begging his new master to please also purchase Dorcas, who he is not ashamed to say is the love of his life. Um, I loves Dorcas, young massa. I loves her well and true. She says she loves me, and I know she does. The good Lord knows I love her better than I loves anyone in the whole wide world. Never can love another woman half so well. Please buy Dorcas, massa. We be good servants to you long as we live. We be married right soon, young massa, and there be some chillun coming, and they be healthy and strong. Massa, and they be good servants too. Please buy Dorcas, young massa. We loves each other a whole heap. Do really do, massa, we do. Whoever this new master was would not buy Dorcas, and that would be the last day that Jeffrey and Dorcas would ever see each other. Um, some of the descendants of Jeffery and Dorcas have been found. And so we know for a fact that they were never reunited. Um, Jeffery was purchased for $1,200, and Dorcas was purchased by another gentleman for the same price. This is actually an ad or a cartoon that was used to share this story of the weeping time. So in African tradition, we have to call the names of our ancestors, those that we know to call. These are some of the humans that were a part of the weeping time. We don't know their story, but we know from the catalog, Bill was a 58-year-old, but Cheney, Grace, Violet, Hannah, Patty, and Joe were of the 30 children that were sold that day, some as young as 3 months old. But remember the first story of a child, a baby born at 15 days prior to the sale, was also sold. So that day brought in $303,850. This got Mr. Butler completely out of debt. He had to do the slave sale because bill collectors were on him. And so, as I mentioned, he was living in Philadelphia. He had to sell the Philadelphia home for $30,000. I think it was $30,000 or $50,000. Then he and Fanny come to Savannah, start living on the Georgia plantation. And then he has to do this sale in order to pay off debtors. So our story ends here because now, as I just mentioned, Mr. Butler is out of debt, and Mortimer records in his story that people were dancing and celebrating and popping bottles of champagne. It was a big day, although it rained for 2 days straight, and our ancestors tell us that it rained because the earth was sad. And it is recorded that it did not stop raining until the very last slave or human, and that would be the 429th human, was sold, or 436th human was sold, and then it stopped raining that second day. So, as I mentioned, there are a lot of people in Savannah who have no idea about the weeping time, let alone the people here in the nation. If you travel about a quarter of a mile west of Savannah, which is where the weeping time actually occurred, there is just this one marker now to tell the story of the largest sale of enslaved persons in U.S. history that took place. And so this marker, placed by the Georgia Historical Society, actually sits on the exact spot where these humans were inspected before going into that enclosed office to be sold off. And so the Butler Island rice plantation still stands today. This was where Pierce Meese Butler and Fanny Kimball Butler would reside. And then what happened was those 440 individuals were taken from Darien, Georgia to Savannah. And by car, that's about a hour's drive. Um, there is no record of how these 440 individuals were transported from Darien, Georgia to Savannah. But once they got to Savannah from this plantation that you see, which now it's a place where you can rent to have weddings, special occasions. People have, what do you call it, family reunions there. So the big house, as we descendants of slaves called them, is still standing. But so these 440 individuals were taken from Darien, from this plantation, taken to Savannah and held in actual horse stables where this where they were kept, and where that marker is the old racetrack. That's what it was then. And so they were kept in horse stables, fed whatever leftover food was provided for them. I do suggest that everyone get the full account of this story written by Dr. Bailey, who's a professor up in upstate New York. She is the one who wrote about the weeping tree and spent a significant amount of time in Savannah. And then, remarkably so, you can actually read the actual account from Mortimer Thompson about, so his entire article. So this is available on Amazon. I think it's about 21, 24 pages, actually has sketches. Some of the pages are very hard to read. It is an old document, but I appreciate the fact that the effort to keep this history, to keep the records there. So it's there for all of us to read for ourselves. And Mr. Butler actually wrote an account of that day within their photos, sketches, his account of the story, which, by the way, he did only after Frances Kimball did her book. Fortunately, she was a very well-known diarist at that time, and she authored many books, and this was one of her most infamous books, The Journal of a Residence on a Georgian Plantation. And it is because of her account, because of this book, that we have an accurate account of what slavery was like in the southern states. So as I end this, and I'm very anxious to hear from Reverend Macaulay, these are my questions that I hope that we can talk about today. What amount of money should the descendants of these humans receive? Because Dr. Bailey was able to find some of these descendants. And what is the price for the emotional distress that Jeffery and Dorcas experienced? And is it reparations or restorative justice that Reverend Macaulay is going to talk with us about today that descendants of slaves deserve, or is it both? I thank you all for listening. This is a very emotional topic, but I'm looking forward to the dialogue that will come out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis. As a reminder to our audience, if you have questions about either of the presentations today or any of the topics that we discussed today, please remember to share them in the comments so we can address them during our open Q&A. We're now going to have a presentation from Pastor Charlie McCulley on More Than Reparations, the Need for Restorative Justice in Addressing America's Slave Legacy. Charlie McCulley is the senior pastor at the Commons Church in Flagstaff, Arizona. His postgraduate degree is from the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, where he studied post-colonialism, biomedical ethics, and the relationship of science and faith. He is also a political activist in the areas of immigration, climate change, and civil rights.
Thank you
Welcome,
so
Pastor
much,
Charlie.
Towson. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Lewis. I wanted to first of all say I am so thrilled to be here with you all today. It is such an honor and a privilege. Ever since Mayor Evans called me and asked me about this opportunity, I've been so excited to share with this community. And the only thing I'm not excited about is that I did have to follow Dr. Lewis in that wonderful presentation. So it's kind of a downgrade for all of you that are watching now. I apologize about that. But I was particularly moved by, I have not heard her presentation and knew very little about the weeping time. And that's kind of, I think, one of the hopes that we had as a panel as we were discussing this is for me to, along with all of you viewers out there, experience Dr. Lewis' presentation and to react to it. I want to start by removing ourselves a little bit from the topic that we're going to talk about today so that we can zoom right back into it, hopefully in a really powerful way. I've been really privileged in the last few months to give a couple of different presentations in different settings about the relationship of white and Black America, specifically one on climate justice and the way environment and climate change disproportionately affects. But when I do that, I like to step back, and that's one of the things I love so much, Dr. Lewis, about your presentation is I'm kind of a history nerd. And to look back in history, sometimes to a fault, we feel removed from that. But we can turn that, I think, into an advantage if we can zoom it back into our life. History has a powerful thing. And I also loved your reference to herstory there, which I think is a way better way of reclaiming the real story of our past. So I like your nod there. But I want to zoom out to something that happened in 2010. In 2010 in Tunisia, around the world, very removed from American experiences. Many of you already know this. I keep coming back to this analogy over and over again because it seems so far away. But in Tunisia, in the Middle East, there was a fruit cart salesman. His name was Mohammed Bouazizi, and every day to make a living, he sold fruit. At the time, Tunisia had slipped into a very oppressive government, and they actually confiscated his fruit cart, which was his only way of making a living. And when they did that, he was so distressed at the oppression of the systems of his government that he actually self-immolated. He lit himself on fire in 2010 and committed suicide. And that single act, that dramatic, emotional, and reactive act to oppression sparked what we now call the Arab Spring. It spread like wildfire across the internet and Twitter in 2010. And millions of people took to the street because of the oppression that they saw from the Tunisian government. 5 different countries' governments were overthrown as millions of people took to the street because that one act of oppression, that story, the power of the narrative, which we just heard from Dr. Lewis and our own history, ignited a movement that changed the Middle East. And there was a second Arab Spring after that. The reason I bring that up is because we're living in a time very similar to that. I don't know how many viewers that are watching this identify as white as I do, and that's one of the things I'm very aware of, is all of the privilege that is inherent in my history and in my current life. But many of us who are white and Black and Indigenous and Latino watched really the lynching of George Floyd and felt emotions that maybe we don't experience on a daily basis. It was very much an Arab Spring type moment in the sense that a narrative, one person's story, captivated a nation. As we watched someone slowly murdered for 8 minutes in cold blood, people took to the streets. People estimate that 15 to 26 million people have gone to the streets in over 60 countries since the murder of George Floyd. Probably the largest movement in our lifetime, if not in centuries. But what's interesting, and I really appreciated that Mayor Coral was on earlier, and Kara and Bernadine, we were all sitting around talking, is that what I'm really interested in talking about is the phenomena of the flash in the pan movement. I went to 5 different Black Lives Matter marches. I took my kids to 5 different Black Lives Matter marches. We felt the emotions as we followed Black leaders and heard them tell their stories, and we tried to learn. I'm from Texas. I grew up in a very conservative area of Texas in the Bible Belt, and I've been very interested in the impact of the Black Lives Matter moment over these several months on some of my family that lives in a very different environment politically than Northern Arizona or Flagstaff. But there was this moment that captivated us, that took us to the streets. But the big question that I want to talk about, to try to respond to, or at least engage in conversation with Dr. Lewis here, is so what? So what are we going to do with this emotion, with this moment? How do we go from here? What do we do? And I know, especially speaking as a white man, I often give the disclaimer, not only am I white, male, Christian, heterosexual, I have every single checkbox in our culture you could possibly have of privilege. I feel a call and a specific passion to talk to people like me who have different layers of privilege, of what should we do, because it is our responsibility as being ancestors of and perpetrators of oppression to be those that educate and advocate for change within our own communities, especially our communities of privilege. And so that's why I'm really thankful to have a chance to be here, and I'm so honored to share this space with this community. I'm really, really excited. There's 3 things I want to talk about really quickly, and I'm most excited about just getting to open discussion. That's my favorite format, is just hearing questions and having conversations. And I also think that's the hope of the world, is real dialogue and interaction instead of definitely not just hearing a white guy tell you what to believe. Not interested in that. But some of the things that have changed me in my story of privilege along the way, I am a pastor and I have a theological background. And when I was working on a master's in Scotland at the University of St. Andrews, I had a very light bulb moment, which for many of you, especially if you're people of color, will probably seem like it was a slow moment to come in my life. But I was very blinded by a lot of things. And I noticed at one moment in my theological education that 98%, if not 100% of every single theological book I had ever read, sorry, I haven't written, was written by a white man. All of the theology that I read was written by a European descendant male. And it was like a light bulb that went on in my head that is the reason that I didn't care about politics, is because it didn't affect me. That is the reason that I was entrenched in a system of belief, because I had no capacity to hear stories or understand stories of people whose life experience were very different than my own. And that's one of the reasons I'm really drawn to even to the title of the series, of the lived Black experience, or the Black lived experience, because I think that's a gift to people like me to get to be invited into spaces where we can learn and listen from a very different experiences than what we had. So what I did is I started reading only theology from Latino and Latina theologians and women and Black theologians like Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas and Dr. James Cone and liberation theologians. And I just wanted to share our personal story. It completely transformed my life in the best of ways. It brought me so much life and connection in my religious experience and my political experience. And so one thing that I want to do is encourage anyone that identifies like me is to wake up in that moment, or have a light bulb of, we have to listen to different voices. That's very, very central. Here's the 3 things I want to talk about. First of all, I want to talk about the word political, because I want to talk about political perspective. Political is such a scary word in our environment, our polarized environment. I think it's a beautiful word. Politics or political comes from this Latin word polis in Latin. And that's just a word that means the city. Because what politics is a group of people who are trying to figure out how to share resources, or where resources should go, or how to solve problems. It's a family dinner table, I think. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Often used the phrase, the beloved community. It's one of my favorite, most poetic phrases that he used often. And I think beloved community is actually a better translation of polis. instead of city if we think of the beloved community. And if we think about politics as the dinner table, and we think about it as beloved community, and we think about how we're going to work together to solve problems and share resources, it doesn't always feel quite as terrifying. And the first thing that I want to talk about as we talk about reparations and restorative justice, which is where I'm heading with all this, is political perspective. And that's kind of what I was alluding to in my own life. But I think that many Americans have blinders on. Again, to use religious language, sometimes we'd like the scales to fall off and see things for how they really are, not see things for the way they have been whitewashed for us. Another really interesting conversation we had before we came on today is, why haven't we learned about the weeping time? Is there a more nefarious explanation why we're logging on today and learning this instead of being taught this in our schools? And there is a nefarious explanation. It has to do with the Texas Board of Education and their inordinate power by conservative white people to whitewash our textbooks, to make sure we don't know the full history of what unfolded in our past. So there's these things that we need, the work we need to do to be able to have a political perspective, a beloved community perspective of what's happened. And the most important thing that I want to talk about is how history can inform us, but it is happening right now. This is not something that just happened in Savannah, Georgia. We've changed the labels of these things, and many of you know so much more about this than I do. Sometimes we call it incarceration instead of slavery. Sometimes we call it redlining or the backing of bank loans, environmental justice. You want to know where pollution happens in America? Do you think that the politics of local and state governments put pollutant and pollutant chemical factories in white, rich neighborhoods? Or do you think they put them in lower income, people of color neighborhoods? I don't even have to show you the well-documented, easy data that it's overwhelmingly in neighborhoods of color. You want to know where highways get put? Interstates through cities? Think about how the politics unfold when one particular group historically for centuries has all the power to make decisions. So the first thing that we need to do, and what I'm so thankful for today in our shared experience with Dr. Lewis, is she has given us another dosage of political perspective, a remembrance of history that connects also to our current state. Policing. I mean, we can go on and on about the way incarceration, policing, all of the injustices that are happening right now. The first thing that all of us have to do is to live in that perspective, because I believe wisdom is found in perspective, and wisdom is this active thing. It's almost a personality that we engage with, and it comes with perspective of where our layers of power and privilege lie and how the actual real world is unfolding. And so for me, this flash in the pan, but more than that, movement of Black lives is an awakening that we have to now act on. We have to be participants in, no matter who we are, no matter what our ethnic heritage is. How do we translate that momentum and energy into what's happening right now, today? So the second thing I want to talk about, that's political perspective. The second thing I want to talk about is political imagination. And this is what I think we are starved of in 2020, often in the political dialogue that we experience, our beloved community dialogue. We're starved of political imagination. And I'm stealing this phrase from my faith tradition, the prophetic imagination. One of the things that's made the Jewish scriptures echo through time and the Christian scriptures are these prophets. And we often get mixed up in American Christianity, or at least in white evangelicalism, with that being about future telling. And that's not what prophets were. They were truth tellers. They spoke truth to power, and they did it with a prophetic imagination, because what they did is they imagined what the world could be like in the very stark reality of what the world was like. Again, great liberation theologians point to the Exodus story, that the unique thing about the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, if you're a Christian in your language, or the New Testament, is that these texts were all written from the perspective of the oppressed people and the broken people. And one of the things that white American Christianity, I'm speaking to my own religious tradition here right now, if you're part of that, one of the things that white Christianity has done and been complicit in perpetrating systemic racism, is white American Christians have read themselves into the story, because it's actually what you do with any historical texts. You paint yourself into the story. Rembrandt used to do that as a great artist. He would paint himself into the story. And when we read a text, we paint ourselves into the story. And what myself and other white Christians have done for centuries is we paint ourselves into the story as Israel, the oppressed people group, or the early Christians under Nero, whereas that's not who we are in the story. We are the benefactors of empire. We are the Egyptians, we are the Babylonians, we are Rome. And that's one of the most powerful things about that kind of resistance literature that is the Bible, is that it speaks truth to power even today in the United States of America, because Rome exists here, power dynamics exist here, empire exists here, colonialism exists here. We just heard so eloquently and so powerfully what colonialism looks like and what white supremacy looks like. So what do we do about it? We have to have political imagination. And that's why I want to just maybe say a few things that I hope will just launch us into some conversation time. A lot of the political imagination happening right now is around words like reparations. I don't know how many of you have had the opportunity to read Ta-Nehisi Coates, I hope I pronounced that right, The Case for Reparations in the Atlantic. There's an audio version of it. So very well read, very narrative driven, beautiful story about what reparations look like. And of course, to define reparations, we're talking about financial restitution for some of the crimes of the past. Now, I am an insider when it comes to white privilege. I've been on golf courses and heard conversations I wish I could unhear. I've listened to white men say things. So if you think ever, if you're a person of color, that, man, maybe it's not that bad, I'm telling you as an insider, I've heard the things that are said by the group that's in power, and it's not good. They are doing everything in their power to stop there from being true equality or a true beloved community in the nation that we live in, this democracy that we love. And political imagination says, what if? It doesn't say, is it economically feasible? That's not the first question you ask. It doesn't say, is this something that's practical? That's not the first question you ask. The first question you ask, is it right? Is it just? And when we hear stories like we just heard, and then we extrapolate that past Reconstruction and the Jim Crow South and the Civil Rights era and the war on drugs and incarceration rates and what we're seeing today with a political party still suppressing the votes of people of color in the South, we're talking about right now there are real financial injustices. So the first question is not, is it practical? The first question is it right? The first question is, can we imagine a different way of being as a country that makes us more the beloved community? And I know that a lot of people's first questions go to the pragmatic, but I think what we need to understand is the pragmatic is not what's keeping reparations from happening. I think I might get this wrong, I think it's Representative Connors, who for decades has opened the House every time trying to put forth a bill to just do research on reparations, and it has never once passed in the United States House, which shows that we're not even interested in learning about the economic impact of slavery, or what that $300,000 that Dr. Lewis just talked about over inflation and time are being emancipated from slavery but given nothing, contra what our biblical text would teach, to have nothing to build wealth on and then to be fought against, as we were talking earlier about the Tulsa bombing of Black Wall Street, or Wilmington, North Carolina, where there's a history of explicit aggression versus Black wealth. So reparations are a conversation we want to have, but today we're going to kind of punt on that, if I understand, and focus on that in a future time. But what we're going to talk about today, which I'm most excited about, is even more radical than that and even more transformative than that. And that's the concept of restorative justice. I came across this phrase when I was in school, and I was learning about the genocide in Rwanda. And I think it's really interesting, especially because sometimes racial conversations are very uncomfortable for people in the United States of America, no matter what color your skin is. We're just not good sometimes at hard conversations and conflict. But when we talk about Rwanda, again, we can almost pull back and think academically for a second, because here we have a very unique system of injustice. It had a root in Belgian colonialism and a dark story behind it. But when the actual violence of the genocide in Rwanda happened, it was Black Christians killing Black Christians over these tribal identities. And I don't want to minimize the role of the Belgian colonialism that led to that, but the actual violence and killing, 800,000 to 1 million people were killed by machetes, by their neighbors, children, and one of the most horrible things that humanity's ever seen. And because of the whitewashing of Eurocentric news cycles, we still think of Hitler and European atrocities, and sometimes something like Rwanda is put on a lower level because it happens in the dark continent of Africa, instead of centering what's happened since the genocide. Because what's happened since that is the story of Rwanda didn't end in 1994. They healed quicker and faster than any anthropological historian could have ever imagined, because of the radical leadership of someone like Desmond Tutu from South Africa, who brought in Black leadership about restorative justice. And they said, it's going to take us 100 years of endless courts to try to get 1 million murders solved. And so what they had is they came up with these things called Grakaka courts, which just means grass. And they would sit in the grass as a community in a village. They were inspired by indigenous peoples. The First Nation peoples of Canada used this restorative justice. The indigenous peoples of New Zealand used this, where the village gathers around and they set down the oppressors and the victims together in a relational setting. And what restorative justice is you let the person who is the victim of the crime, those that have been hurt and harmed, explain and tell their story to the oppressors. And the oppressors have a chance to apologize and be a part of deciding together what the solution is. Now, I want to just, before we launch in this conversation, make a couple distinctions. That's very different than American justice. It's very different than European or Eurocentric justice, which is retributive justice, which is revengeful or punitive justice. Who did wrong and what can we do to punish them? And will that scare everyone else into behaving? Well, what we know from centuries of Eurocentric retributive justice is it doesn't work. What it does is it creates more injustice. It's the cycle of violence that never ends. The first thing the Rwandans did, the new government that had fought against the genocide, the first thing they did is abolish the death penalty. The first statement that they wanted to make is that we will end the cycle of violence and we will enter into a restorative justice pattern. So what does that look like for us when we talk about the racial tensions in the United States of America today, the real systemic injustices that exist today, and the historical history? The short answer is, I don't know. But I definitely want to be a part of the conversation. I definitely believe the hope of this conversation is when people of indigenous history and ancestry and Black Americans and Latino and Latinx Americans and white Americans, every color and every stripe and every gender and every orientation, come to the table together and we sit at the grass and we recognize real oppression. We don't avoid it. We start to discuss things like reparation and, more important, restorative justice. Very last thought. And I really took my cue here from Mayor Evans, because when she first heard this lecture, she shared that one of her first experiences was there's no amount of money, to your question, Dr. Lewis, that could ever make up for that story of Dorcas and Jeffrey. In one sense, I think she's right, because money has the ability to devalue, ironically, something of real emotional sense. But I don't think that means no reparations on the table. I actually don't think that at all. But what I do think is really interesting about her understanding it is if I apply it to an unhealthy relationship that I'm counseling as a pastor, sometimes I enter into a discussion with a couple, and there's a power dynamic in that couple. It's not egalitarian. They're not truly equals. There's an oppressor and there's a victim in there. And sometimes let's even imagine that there's a financial, let's make up an imaginary couple where a man is a horribly abusive man and he has a wife that he controls and actually even makes her work and takes all of her money and goes golfing in this hypothetical situation. Well, what would justice look like here? And if the answer was, we'll pay her back all of the money that you stole from her, well, that would be part of it, but that certainly wouldn't fix the problem. That wouldn't change the power dynamic. It wouldn't change the history of that couple. It wouldn't change the abusive behavior of this man. There may not be hope for a couple like that, but if there is hope, if there is to be liberation for that hypothetical couple, it has to be, first of all, liberation for the oppressed wife, total and complete liberation and equality. And it also requires liberation of the oppressor. And this is the centerpiece of true restorative justice. And I will be very clear that I have only learned this from Black theologians and philosophers. I've never once heard this from a European white theologian or philosopher, although I'm sure they exist. I learned it from Black leaders that liberation has to be liberation for all. It has to be liberation for the oppressed, and it has to be liberation for the oppressors, or else they will keep oppressing. It has to be something that we imagine together and at an equal table, at a really big equal table, that changes the very way we exist as a country or a town or a community or a state or a county or a family or a relationship. So that's the things that inspire me. And I think that I would like to just transition us with the thought that when I talk about the transformation that's happened in my life, reading and listening to leaders of color, the last thing that I would say, if you're someone like me out there, is to follow the leaders. We don't have to be the leaders communally on this. One of the things that I found so attractive about the movement for Black Lives is this phrasing I just found so attractive. They said that unlike the civil rights era where you had these very clear leaders at the front who could be assassinated, Right now, what we have in the movement for Black Lives is not a leaderless movement, a leaderful movement. And I love that phrase. There's something happening in our country right now. And at the front, there's a whole bunch of leaders. It's full of leaders like Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas or Ta-Nehisi Coates or Jamar Tisby or endless name of others who are leading the way. So the last thing that I would say is we need to follow the leaders as we try to take on this power dynamic and this unhealthy relationship to hopefully bring about a better beloved community. So that's my thoughts. I'd love to hear what we have next.
Thank you very much. We're going to launch right into our questions. And before I go into questions, I just want to read really quickly an excerpt from Christopher Monroe's 2004 article in The Atlantic about the weeping time, that I think kind of launches us into this discussion that we're having. And he said, the city of Savannah should be commended for recognizing this monumental event with a historical marker. But one small plaque in a remote West Savannah park doesn't nearly do justice to the memory of the people who were bought and sold so many years ago. Our country, particularly the South, is full of these hidden histories, and if we as citizens don't labor to remember these admittedly ugly episodes of our past, we're doing not just ourselves a disservice, but we're desecrating the memory of the enslaved people who helped build this country. So with that, I want to launch into first a question for you, Reverend Dr. Lewis, and it goes back to your introduction of the conversation. I wanted to just call attention to the opening of your presentation where you spoke about recognizing the ancestors, which is a moment of deep historic and spiritual tradition within the Black community. Can you tell us about this recognition and tell us why it's important in binding the narrative of the past to our conversation today? You're muted.
You and I are here today because of them. You know, being raised, my home is still on the land that my great grandmother slaved on. The big house where she worked is right up the road from that house, and so to still have to see that and to remember. I'm not far from that. I'm not so far removed from that experience. And so in African tradition, we acknowledge that our ancestors paved the way so that we may look around us and be reminded that we are here because of them and the path that they made for us. And so for any Black person that lives in Savannah, you're reminded of that every day and you're humbled by that. And I know that I am, because they were and they are, my elders are. And to really live that every day. And we just accept that that is our way of life, that is our tradition as African peoples.
Thank you. Along with that, I think we'll also have the question from our audience, and Pastor McCauley, this is going to be aimed more towards you. You have within the Black culture that tradition of recognizing our ancestors and recognizing that we are here because of them. And part of, I think, the struggle that we see within restorative justice and within this conversation, as we talk about how the oppressor has that opportunity to hear and recognize the oppressions that have been perpetrated and work together with the oppressed towards a solution. But in the case of America, as you identified during your presentation, we're talking about hundreds of years of history, and we're talking about a system of slavery in that form that is long over, although, as you also pointed out, we have modern imprisonment and the prison system and other forms of enslavement. So how do we reconcile that with the call for restorative justice today? Are we calling for a modern apology for historic wrongs, or are we discussing something deeper and further beyond that? And with that, if you can also go just a little bit further into what it means for the oppressor to be liberated as part of this narrative.
Wow, yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I'll start with sticking with the analogy of an unhealthy relationship. If I was counseling someone in an unhealthy relationship with this power dynamic, and the person said, well, what are you asking, for the oppressor to apologize? Well, the answer is not no, but it's certainly more than that, because those words don't have any value when you're the oppressor. Or at least they have little value. They're a starting point. They're a spark of a fire if they represent a change that's happening. So one of the things that I've noticed in actually counseling people is that sometimes it's best to speak less and do more and listen more, especially if you're coming from that power dynamic. Now, when you talk about the distance of time between slavery and now, there's so many different angles to take for someone, especially I'm thinking of someone who's kicking back against all this, saying like, hey, I didn't own slaves. I like Black people. I'm a good white guy. I'm a good white girl. Well, there's so many problems with that, and there's so many different angles that you can approach. It's not completely untrue. They don't probably own slaves, and they might, at least on some conscious level, think that they don't harbor any actual individual bigotry, but that's something none of us know or can sort out. We all have to do our own work to figure out our own biases, and psychoanalytically, that's a big thing to unpack. But what we can concretely talk about is systems of racism. And this is another buzzword that really turns people off. They think systems can't be racist. And I say, well, that's what we need to talk about, because systems of racism, like the incarceration system that we have in America, where you're 5 times more likely as a Black man than me to be incarcerated, even though we commit crimes at the same rate. It's a system that actually doesn't require any racist individuals in it. Now, I'm not saying there aren't racist individuals in it, but the system itself will perpetuate racist results. Our incarceration system at this point doesn't even need any racists to do that. It's in the paperwork itself. We know this. It's in our founding documents and the Free Fifth Compromise. One of the things that's unique about America is that we have enshrined on racism. It's in our documents to see. In the Declaration of Independence, we call natives savages. It's there for everybody to see. We have actually indoctrinated it. And then the thing about text and indoctrination is they live on, and it exists to this day. And I think the thing that I'm always trying to talk to people about is because I'm trying to move people forward in their understanding and their journey. I'm trying to help them understand. I try to stay away from talks about individual racism. So for instance, in a political dialogue, I'll be politically incorrect here, but I'm in a lot of political conversations about a presidential election, and I don't want to spend a lot of time trying to convince a Donald Trump supporter that he's personally not racist. I believe that he is, but I don't know Donald Trump, and how could I ever with data show that his heart is racist? To me, that's a loss of time when I could easily turn that conversation to the policies of the Trump administration and say, you can talk about his heart all day long. Let's talk about kids in cages at the border. That was something I found so compelling about Dr. Lewis' presentation, that even the chattel slave owners of South Carolina wouldn't separate families at the border when they arrived here. And we're doing that today. And so we can talk about racist policies without having to determine a heartbeat. And that's why I think a lot of the hope of this restorative conversation is to focus on systems and policies, because we won't get derailed by trying to read people's hearts. And along the way, I think hearts will get changed too. Because narratives and stories, which I think is really important. I don't know if I fully understood your question, but hopefully that was.
I think you hit it on the head. Thank you. I think a big question that we've seen it start to be formulated in the comments, but I want to take even a step further beyond. The question that was put in the comments was, who should apologize for slavery? But I think the bigger question is, who are we talking about when we talk about being involved in restorative justice? Is it just one group of people who is apologetic and working towards this? Is it our political leaders that we're asking to do this? Or is it something bigger that's involving more of us and that individual level, that discussion that we had of the beautiful community? So who is responsible for this work?
Both. And I think that's what we learned from the leaders of the restorative justice movement, which really has gained its own dialectic or language since the early 90s. But really, what we've learned from indigenous communities is that it has to happen at a very organic level that includes everyone, the village level. I mean, even at the crime level, because we're really all this starts is in a village type anthropological setting. If a crime happens, you have to get the perpetrator together with the victim. So we're talking about at every level when individual things happen. But the other piece of restorative justice is it can be representative. And so in one sense, we could make today an example of restorative justice, what we're doing right now, at the representative level. I can represent my tradition, even though I do want to be clear, white is not actually an ethnicity. It's a construct and a power dynamic. So I'm going to say I identify as white, which identifies me with this past, and I can represent that community group, and you both can represent your ancestry and history, and we can model in a performance art what restorative justice looks like, because what's happened is Dr. Lewis has shared her story, and she has shared a personal narrative that reflects an injustice done. And I can represent my community, and I can apologize, and I will in this performance art, not to devaluate it. To me, art is more true and more powerful, not less true and less powerful. And I will apologize on behalf of those that I was not a part of in my existence of life, but I will represent that community and say, I'm so incredibly sorry for the endless violence and oppression and robbery and kleptocracy and oligarchy and rape and institutional sin and organizational corporate and individual sin. I truly am sorry as a representative of that community. And this can be an example of what some restorative justice is the beginning of. But if our conversation ended there, it would seem really empty. It would be maybe a moment of hope. But if it didn't turn into action, me as a representative and you as a representative, of what we then will do with our votes, what we then will do with our political imagination, what our next steps will be, then we won't be modeling restorative justice very well.
We had a question come in through the chat of, is restorative justice a reality or a possibility for historical trauma? So is it possible to get restorative justice now for an historical trauma that we're discussing as we talk about the legacy of slavery? And that's for either of you.
Okay, Dr. Lewis, you want to take that?
No, I would like to hear the answer from you.
Okay, so I'd like to say, first of all, my favorite answer is always, I don't know. I think that's really important and healthy in all dialogue. Especially, my wife is getting her PhD and is a specialist in trauma. And so when that word comes up, it means a lot. And it means a lot probably to a lot of the viewers who are watching this who've experienced all layers of trauma imaginable: sexual trauma, religious trauma, racial trauma. Historical trauma is a unique phrase. And I think, and I want to just get clarity here. Are you asking, is there hope that restorative justice can do something when the trauma took place so far in the past? Is that kind of the question? I
think so, yeah.
Okay, I think that what I would take as a stab at that is the power of history in the past. It echoes through time. That history is a part of us. Can we fix slavery or ever make it right? No. Can an abusive husband ever take away, or an abusive wife ever take away what they've done? No. We can't make it go away. Is there an amount of money that would ever make it right? No, but that doesn't mean some money might be a part of a collective solution that we come up with together. But when it comes to historical trauma, even though we can't take away the real event, we have to recognize that it still exists. I mean, I think that would be my main message, especially to people who identify as white, who are trying to avoid the discomfort. I mean, I have found as a pastor that discomfort is the very thing that we need the most. It's a gift that transforms us. And I think, and I often quote Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. This passage of that letter. By the way, he wrote the letters from Birmingham jail to white pastors. That's me. So like he wrote that letter to me, even though it was in history, it changed my life. Because in the middle of that letter, he said that what he's worried about is not the Ku Klux Klan or the White Council. He's like, he knows who they are. What he's worried about is the white moderate pastor who, he says, prefer the negative peace, which is an absence of tension, to the positive peace, which is the presence of justice. They prefer the negative peace, which is an absence of tension, to the positive peace, which is the presence of justice. That phrase has changed my life because I know exactly what it's like as a white pastor and a white male in America to prefer the negative peace of a lack of tension. I know that feeling because when you're in the privileged group, it's just nice to go, can't we just all think life is great and be thankful all the time because you're not being oppressed because the system isn't affecting you. And that's not real peace. That's a lack of discomfort. What we need is a holy discomfort, or what you mentioned earlier from Dr. Lewis, from John Lewis, is the good trouble. We need the discomfort to make us unrestful, to question things so that we can deal with that level of historic trauma and hope for real change.
Reverend Lewis, when we talk about, I think this is really at the heart of this discussion. What are we talking about when we talk about reparations? Are we talking about paying off people's pain, or is it something deeper and broader than that? And to partner on that question, so I'm going to ask you for an answer on that, but then also Pastor Charlie to just talk about the difference between reparations as repayment versus reparations as restoration.
I think reparations is both physical, tangible, and spiritual. Because so on my father's side, the land on Sapelo Island, which is very close to right next to Darien, my grandmother got her so-called 40 acres and a mule. So that land that the family's house is on right now, that was given to her upon her freedom from slavery, and she got a few livestock to go and start her new life. Can I say that has made a great difference in the lives of all of my relatives, all of the descendants on Sapelo Island? We're the descendants of slaves. Has that given us a better life? I mean, it's nice to say that you're a landowner, but now I'm being taxed out of the property. So it makes it very difficult to hold on to the property, and many of us have sold off pieces of our land or all of it, me included. So we really will have to take a coming together. We talk about this sitting at the table to talk, we really will have to come together to really have that conversation of, because now maybe then it was as simple as 40 acres and a mule. 400 years later, it's not that simple. It's not that simple at all.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. Whatever it isn't simple at all. It's complex, but that shouldn't make us lack hope. And I don't hear that in you at all. I think you're very hopeful. But I think that when I think of reparations specifically, because I think the question was, what are we talking about here? It is certainly the first thing to say bigger than a check. For all the reasons that it's complicated. A check is complicated. Any thinking person can think of all the practical complications of a check. Doesn't mean a check shouldn't happen, like a stimulus check that happens all the time in America. But when we come together with great minds and think collectively together, if we can model that kind of restorative justice, I'm actually amazed at what human beings can come up with. And things have worked in the past. Affirmative action, is it perfect? No. Has it made the world a little better? Yes. Are we there? Not even close. The Rooney Rule in the NFL, is it perfect? No. Does it help? Yes. So what we can say is when we collectively dream about ways to repair, that's the base word of reparations, to repair, it's not that intimidating. We repair things all the time. I think that it requires a little bit of, prophetic and political imagination that we can do hard things. And that includes reparations, and that includes us figuring out really creative property issues and laws. We can figure out scholarships, education, military. There's every layer of complex political things. We can talk about race, and we can talk about history, and we can talk about repairing, and we can talk about changing things. Look, we can all say together, when you look at the Fortune 500 companies, and you look how many of their CEOs are white men, and compare that to how many white men there are in America, it's not representative. There's a money problem. There's a power dynamic. These are simple problems we can agree on. That's step one. That's the perspective. Step two is then let's come to the table together and say, let's fix these problems. And I would say to a more conservative, white identifying person out there who's very fearful of these conversations, remember that first of all, it's just and right. Now we can start talking about the practical thing. And equality does not mean reverse oppression. That's the fear of power dynamics. When you are in a power dynamic and you're the person of privilege, equality always feels like persecution. And that's what we see in America. White Americans afraid they're being persecuted if any idea of equality comes to the table. What we got to remember is that we all go up together. This is not a zero-sum game. Our economy grows together. We're better together. We belong together. And equality is not oppression. It's quite the opposite. And that's very hard for oppressors. That's one of the things you asked there was, what does it mean to liberate the oppressors? You got to be liberated of your fear. You got to be liberated as an oppressor and be afraid that if everyone else got what you got, it's actually better that way. Like, it's a better world. It's a more beloved community. It's not an oppression against you. And I think that's something I would encourage to people who are afraid of that, is to not be afraid. Perfect love drives out fear. And I think we don't have enough love in our politics. And I don't think we have enough love often in our conversations about race. But when we rest in love and we really love each other and believe we belong to each other, then we really actually want equality. And I think that's hard for people on an unconscious level, especially when they're in the privileged position. I don't think they would articulate it, but I don't think they really want equality. But they do. They just don't know it. They don't know how great it is. That's the hope that I would like to give to people.
Ms. House, can I jump in?
Mm-hmm.
Can I put out there that maybe, just to begin to have this conversation? I mean, I love what we're doing here through this project, but it's going to take higher leadership to bring this conversation to America. Like, I mean, imagine what it would be like if our president, and not necessarily this current president, but whomever would be in a position to put this conversation out, to extend, because I do think reparations has to first begin with an apology from the nation. I think that's the beginning of it, and then we move from there. But if we continue to have leadership at that level, saying, well, let's embrace it. That was just a part of our history and we got over it. And now here we are. That is not enough. We really have to have the hard conversation, and it has to start from the Capitol.
Absolutely. And the force that makes the Capitol do that is the people. And Abraham Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he became one with the influence of Frederick Douglass and the pressure of the people. Lyndon B. Johnson was not excited about the Voting Rights Act, but the people in this great democracy forced his hand as a leader. Time and time again, we see that we're not helpless as a people. Our beloved community can force the hand of those leaders. And also, and even more hopeful, we can actually elect the leaders that want to do that without being forced. We can elect women of color and people of color and white people who are on board with being liberated from their oppression. We can vote for people that don't have to be forced into being decent, loving members of the beloved community. I think there's hope on two fronts there.
I had a different question that I was about to ask, but I want to go to something that you just said, Pastor Charlie, about this involving not only people of color as part of this, but the phrase you used was white people who want to be liberated from their oppression. And I want to hone in on that for just a moment. Because I think that's an important thing for people to recognize in this discussion of oppression and reparation and restoration within our nation. Who are we talking about when we talk about the oppressed? Within the idea of restorative justice, but particularly when it comes to the history of America with the Black community, because I think it's easy for us to identify that Black people have been oppressed by this system and the system of slavery and systems subsequent to it, but does that oppression go beyond that? I think that's an important answer that folks need to hear as part of this.
Yes, and I think I will be very inadequate in answering that because, again, it's very hard for me from my positions of privilege to see this. But first of all, oppression comes in so many different flavors. We certainly know our LGBTQI plus friends and siblings have experienced a level of oppression that we're just beginning to understand and listen to their experience. But also, even when you ask about the Black community, who is oppressed, I'll give you an insider into what white conservative men would say. Oh, well, look at this Black person who's really successful, an athlete, like he's not oppressed. I'm like, well, first of all, let's talk about policing. Let's talk about experiences throughout a whole life, but let's also talk about what some African-American siblings have to give up to live the wealthy life in America. What they have to sell of their soul at times to be a part of a system that will accept them. What they might have to experience from their own community as a sellout is if they end up in an upper echelon. I mean, these are things that I shouldn't be speaking of. You can both speak so much more eloquently about. But oppression is a complicated bear. It's not simple. And there are white people who are oppressed in different ways. There are people in Appalachia who experience the oppression of poverty. Poverty is an oppression. And we need to talk more about poverty in our political discourse that is not blind to color because it disproportionately affects people of color. But if you're a completely poor white person, you're experiencing a different type of oppression from our capitalistic economy, that you're experiencing oppression as well. Women experience oppression. What we have to be careful doing is ever creating a new box of who's in the oppressed group. And if we ever stop listening to the different layers of oppression that exist, that's why this conversation has to keep happening in our beloved community. And we have to keep centering the voices who are oppressed. That's what I was really drawn to in liberation theology, is to not I mean, I think it would be strange and weird to say you should never listen to a white old man. I'm going to be a white old man. Doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to anything I'm ever going to say. But what we need to do is stop centering white voices. My voice can still exist at the table, but it can no longer be centered. It can no longer given priority. What we need to do is center LGBTQI plus voices and women's voices and Black voices and Latino voices and Indigenous voices and whatever climate victims, whatever color skin there are. We need to center their voices so that we keep learning what oppression is. And I know that doesn't really give an answer, but that's just the way, that's the only thing I can think of to how we handle like who is oppressed. It's a big group of people.
Yeah, so we are coming towards the end of our program, and so I just have two more questions. The first goes back to something that you said early in the presentation, Pastor Charlie, which was the big question of, so what? And I think that is the question that we are answering here. So what is our so what in all of this? What are we being called to do? Who is being called to do it? And what does that look like?
Would you like to go first, Dr. Lewis? Oh, so I guess what I would say is there's layers to that. There's kind of an individual choices that we make. If this is something that inspires you, going back to the thinking of Mohammed Bouazizi and the Arab Spring, or thinking of George Floyd, if there's something that's stirring in us, we have some individual choices to make. So one of the so what's that I'm hoping to get across, especially to people like me, is start following leaders who are leaders of color. And that's an intentional choice you have to make. You have to decide where you're reading, what articles you're reading, what podcasts you're listening to, what Netflix shows you're watching. We make personal choices every day, and sometimes it's overwhelming because there's so many choices that we make, but we can have a little change in our heart to say, I'm going to do something intentional. Just like if I'm going to start running or go on a diet, I'm going to change my diet of information that comes in. I'm going to listen to the experiences of people who are not like me. And I think this is the lowest level, but it may be the most important level, because sometimes the lowest level is what virally goes up the chain. So we make these individual choices. And then we go from one ourself inward to those closest to us. We have brave conversations. I think America changes around the Thanksgiving dinner table, and a lot of people want to avoid hard conversations. But to me, that's that negative piece. That's the avoiding of tension instead of a positive piece of let's have a hard conversation with those we love the most. It doesn't matter, and that applies to whoever you are watching this, whatever color your skin is or your gender. Like, let's just be brave, strong people and follow leaders who are brave and strong. And let's have wonderful, rich, hard conversations with those that we love. So then our little circle of one grows out a little bit. But then we start talking about our beloved community. And politically, I think there's two things. I think you think about your vote. And for me, it's kind of a no-brainer in our current climate, which party is at least more committed, not that it is beyond criticism, but at least more committed to not being a racially divided, hateful country. And I think we got to be brave and go vote and get other people to do that. And then activism, I think, is where we are dreaming big about our beloved community. And that's where we take to the streets. It's where we call our congresspeople and our senators. It's where we maybe run for office ourselves. It's where we show up at meetings. I mean, how many of you right now, whoever's out there watching this, you're doing it right now. Like right now, you're doing it. You're so what? You're listening and learning, and you're part of a conversation. And I just want to encourage everybody in that you're right now, you're doing something. You're a part of something. There's a whole lot of people on Sunday afternoon right now that aren't doing this. So all of you get extra bonus points for doing this thing.
Yeah. Wow.
Reverend Lewis, did you have thoughts on that question, or?
No, the only thing that really comes to mind is that Pastor Charlie needs a big church where we can go and have these conversations. At the end of the day, what I'm hearing is we need more accomplices, not allies. We're beyond allies now. We need more accomplices, and our accomplices are our European American brothers and sisters. And when we begin to have these as our Sunday conversations, um, we can walk through scripture to see that we have been here before, but we have triumphed. And so we can manifest that uh, for ourselves in this day and time. But it's going to have to take, I think my question is not really a statement. My question is, and I know we have to go, but how do we get more accomplices is what I'm taking away today, or the one question that I'm taking away today from this conversation is, how do we get more accomplices, and how do we bring more love to the nation, so that we can begin to, because if there is true love for our brothers and our sisters, no matter how we look, then we can have reparations, whatever that is going to look like. We can come to the table and have that conversation, and there can be an apology. No one will be afraid or ashamed, or find reasons not to do that, why that is not a good idea.
And I'm so glad you put it that way and you said that, because I think that is the final thought and the final question for this conversation is uh, recognizing that in this great discussion of restoration, we recognize that there's that broader communal, historical, and spiritual fact that you cannot have restoration without love. And so the final question really is, uh, how do we go about growing love? What does that look like? And what does it mean to grow love in part of this discussion of restoration?
Yeah, I think for me, a couple things. Well, first of all, Dr. Lewis, you asked the question, how do you get more accomplices? And you're doing it. You're telling stories. I mean, I think that stories and narrative are really what change most people, not theology school or philosophy. I don't think that's how most people change their mind. I think it's stories, it's names and faces, it's relationships. So keep telling stories, keep doing what you're doing, and that's the way forward. And I think to your question, Kara, it'd be more love is such a verb. When I think about just pastoring our church, some love is just so intuitive. Motherly love, where I see the divine nature, and a mother breastfeeding is just a pure form of unconditional love. Some of it's intuitive, some of it's inspired. There's the wind or spirit gets in someone and they go serve the poor. Or I'm just thinking of our church and people putting food boxes together for undocumented families. You go do it. You just go be love. It's one of those put me in the game, coach kind of things. It's not a sitting in the stands. It's getting out there and just start loving. And I think it just grows when you do that, because then when you're doing that, then all of a sudden you're getting more relationships and more stories and more inspiration. It's just like everybody just gets more. It's just good.
Yeah.
Reverend Lewis, did you have thoughts on that question, or should we?
No, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think I'm reading a message from Mrs. Finger, but she and her husband are big supporters of the Murdoch Center and of this project. And so she said, you are enlisting accomplices by having the courage to host these meetings. And so I think that is confirmation that we are doing what we should be doing. We're not here by accident. That this is a work that needs to be done, and prayerfully the fire will catch, and other communities will begin to do these in other states and cities and towns. So that's how I think we can ignite and bring back love, which will bring about healing to the nation.
Amen. Well, thank you both for your presentations and engaging in this conversation. And thank you as well to our audience for participating, listening, and being part of this process. You know, we just discussed that part of creating greater love is being willing to engage in these conversations. But part of the process as well is also being willing to listen and being willing to learn and take that learning and move forward with your life, living differently now that you know that there are these things that are happening, that have happened, and that will continue to happen unless we collectively come to the table and work to change things. We are grateful always to Mayor Evans for helping to frame these conversations and giving us space to have this conversation. We're grateful to the Murdoch Center and the Southside Community Association for hosting on their Facebook page, as well as to the various community members who are part of these conversations and planning processes on an ongoing basis. We invite you to rejoin us for our next Live Black Experience session this Wednesday on Jim Crow's private prison system, where we will be discussing structural racism in America's private prison industrial complex. As always, we encourage you to come participate in that conversation and ask your questions. That will be Wednesday from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Following that session, we'll have another session in a few weeks on November 4th that will be discussing redlining the American dream. That will be a focused discussion on structural racism, redlining practices, including the ongoing affordable workforce housing versus NIMBYism conversation and the American dream of home ownership. So we, again, thank all those who joined us today. We encourage you to continue joining us, continue engaging in these conversations, and helping us to grow love as we work towards restorative justice in our country. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you.